Rachel Monroe had learned to ignore the whispers long before she earned her wings. At 27, she moved through Nellis Air Force Base with the quiet confidence of someone who had something to prove, but refused to show desperation. Her blonde hair was always regulation perfect beneath her flight cap, her posture military straight, and her voice steady in a way that unnerved the older pilots who expected rookies to stumble over radio protocols. The morning sun beat down on the Nevada tarmac as Rachel walked toward the flight operations building, her helmet bag slung over one shoulder. She'd been transferred from intelligence coordination to active flight duty after scoring perfect marks on every simulation test the instructors could throw at her. But perfect scores on a computer screen meant nothing to the men who'd been flying real missions for decades. "There goes Monroe's girl," she heard Lieutenant Jackson mutter to his buddy near the hangar entrance. The words followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Being Colonel Monroe's daughter had opened doors, but it had also painted a target on her back that glowed brighter with every achievement. Inside the ready room, the familiar smell of coffee and jet fuel mixed with tension you could cut with a knife. Major Kevin Brooks, the squadron leader, stood at the front addressing the morning briefing. His eyes found Rachel as she took her seat in the back row, and something flickered across his face. Not quite respect, not quite dismissal, but something colder. "Pilots, we have a special visitor today," Brooks announced, his voice carrying that particular military blend of authority and barely concealed irritation. "General William Garrison from Pentagon Air Operations is conducting a surprise inspection. He'll be observing our training exercises, so I expect everyone to perform at their absolute best." The room buzzed with nervous energy. Garrison was a legend, a man who'd flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts and had never been impressed by anything less than perfection. Rachel felt her stomach tighten, but kept her expression neutral. "Call signs for today's exercise," Brooks continued, reading from his clipboard. "Lightning 1, Hawk 7, Steel Eagle, and—" he paused, his lips curving into what might have been a smirk. "Echo 5. A few pilots chuckled. Echo 5. The call sign had been assigned after a simulator malfunction during her evaluation, where her audio feed cut out completely, forcing her to fly a perfect mission using only visual cues and instinct. Most pilots would have panicked. Rachel had landed with precision that made her instructors recheck their equipment, but to everyone else in the squadron, Echo 5 sounded like something a kid would pick for a video game. "Questions?" Brooks asked, his gaze sweeping the room but lingering on Rachel. She raised her hand. "Sir, what's the mission profile for today's exercise?" Brooks' smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Air-to-air combat simulation, dogfighting maneuvers, under pressure. Think you can handle that, Echo 5? The way he said her call sign made it sound like a joke. Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. "Yes, sir." "Good, because General Garrison specifically requested to observe our newest pilot in action." Brooks closed his folder with a sharp snap. "Don't disappoint us, Monroe." As the briefing ended, Rachel gathered her materials and headed for the door. She could feel eyes on her back, hear the whispered conversations that always seemed to start when she walked by. But one voice cut through the others, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, one of the few pilots who'd never treated her like an outsider. "Rachel," he called, jogging to catch up with her outside the building. "You good?" She nodded, though her jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. "Just another day in paradise." Marcus glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Listen, I heard some things about today's exercise. Brooks has been planning something special for weeks, ever since he found out about the General's visit." "What kind of something?" "The kind that involves putting the new pilot in a situation where failure is the most likely outcome." Marcus's expression was serious. "He's paired you against Captain Rick Dalton for the dogfighting sim." Rachel's blood ran cold. Dalton was the squadron's ace, a pilot with over 15 years of combat experience and a reputation for aggressive tactics that skirted the edge of regulations. He'd never lost a training exercise, and his ego was as large as his skill was undeniable. "Why would Brooks do that?" Marcus shrugged, but his eyes were sympathetic. Maybe he thinks you need humbling. Maybe he wants to show the general that nepotism doesn't belong in the cockpit. Either way, you're walking into a setup. The weight of it settled on Rachel's shoulders like lead. She'd known this day would come, the day when being Colonel Monroe's daughter would matter less than proving she belonged in the sky. But she'd hoped for a fair fight, not a public execution disguised as training. "Thanks for the heads up," she said quietly. "Rachel." Marcus touched her arm. "You're one of the best pilots I've ever seen. Don't let them make you forget that." She managed a smile, though it felt forced. "See you up there." As Marcus walked away, Rachel stood alone on the tarmac, watching the morning sun climb higher into the desert sky. In 3 hours, she'd be strapped into an F-16, facing off against an opponent who'd been chosen specifically to break her. The whispers would become cheers when she failed, and all the perfect simulation scores in the world wouldn't matter. But something stirred deep in her chest. Not fear, but a quiet determination that had been building for months. They wanted to see what she was made of? Fine. She'd show them exactly what Colonel Monroe had taught his daughter during those secret flight lessons in the New Mexico desert, when the world was quiet and the only thing that mattered was the conversation between pilot and machine. The sky was calling, and Rachel Monroe had never been one to ignore a challenge. The morning briefing had left a taste in Rachel's mouth like copper and diesel fuel. She walked across the tarmac toward her assigned F-16, her pre-flight checklist, memorized down to the last bolt and wire. Around her, the base hummed with unusual activity, more ground crew than normal, extra officers scattered near the observation tower, and the unmistakable presence of General Garrison himself, standing, with his arms crossed beside a black sedan. Major Brooks appeared at her elbow as she approached her aircraft. "Monroe, a word." She stopped, turning to face him. Up close she could see the lines around his eyes, the careful way he held his mouth when he was about to deliver bad news, wrapped in official language. "I wanted to clarify today's exercise parameters," he said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby personnel to hear. "This is a standard air-to-air combat simulation. However, given your limited experience in actual dogfighting scenarios, I've taken the liberty of adjusting the rules." Rachel felt her stomach drop. "Adjusted how, sir?" "Captain Dalton will be flying with full electronic warfare capabilities, jamming, countermeasures, the works. You'll be operating with basic systems only." Brooks smiled, that cold smile again. "We want to see how you perform under real pressure, not hide behind technology." It was worse than Marcus had warned her. In a real dogfight, both pilots would have access to the same equipment. This wasn't training. It was sabotage dressed up as a teaching moment. "Sir, with respect, that seems like a fair assessment of your actual abilities," Brooks interrupted. "I agree. The general, specifically, requested to see how our newest pilot handles adversity. Consider this your chance to prove you belong here." Rachel's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. "Understood, sir." As Brooks walked away, she caught sight of Lieutenant Webb near the fuel trucks. He gave her a look that said everything. He'd heard, and he was as angry as she was. But anger wouldn't help her in the cockpit. 20 minutes later, Rachel was strapped into her F-16, running through final system checks. The radio crackled to life with the familiar voice of the air traffic controller. "Echo 5, you are cleared for takeoff. Proceed to training area Delta 7 and await further instructions." "Echo 5, copy, wheels up," the F-16 responded, to her touch like a living thing, lifting off the runway with a power that never failed to thrill her. Below, Nellis Air Force Base shrank to a collection of buildings and geometric patterns etched into the desert floor. Above, nothing but blue sky and the promise of conflict. "Echo 5, this is Viper Lead," came Captain Dalton's voice over the radio, using his call sign. "Hope you're ready for a real lesson today, rookie." Rachel keyed her radio. "Echo 5 ready for engagement." She could hear the smirk in his voice. "We'll see about that." The exercise began simply enough. Basic maneuvers, formation flying, radio protocol checks. But Rachel could feel the tension building, like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. In the observation tower below, General Garrison was watching through binoculars, and she knew that everything she did in the next 30 minutes would define her career. Echo 5, Viper lead, Dalton's voice crackled through her headset. Command has authorized free engagement. Let's see what you've got. The F-16 banked hard to the right as Dalton immediately went aggressive, diving below her altitude and pulling up in a climbing attack. Rachel responded instinctively, rolling inverted and pulling down toward the deck, a maneuver that used gravity and momentum to break the attack angle, but Dalton had expected it. His electronic warfare suite lit up her cockpit with warning signals, jamming her radar and making it nearly impossible to track his position. She was flying half-blind while he had every advantage technology could provide. "Come on, Echo 5, his voice taunted over the radio. "I thought Monroe's daughter was supposed to be special." The words hit like a physical blow, but Rachel forced herself to focus. Her father had taught her that the best pilots didn't rely on instruments. They flew by instinct, by feel, by the subtle vibrations that told them where their aircraft wanted to go. She killed her radio entirely, shutting out Dalton's taunts and the chatter from the control tower. In the sudden silence, she could hear her own breathing, feel the pulse of the engine through the airframe, sense the invisible currents of air that surrounded her aircraft. Dalton was somewhere above and behind her, using his electronic advantages to maintain position while he set up for the killing shot, but advantages could become weaknesses if you relied on them too heavily. Rachel pulled her F-16 into a climb so steep it bordered on dangerous, pushing the aircraft beyond normal operational limits. The G-forces pressed her deep into her seat, threatening to black her out, but she held on. At the peak of the climb, she rolled inverted and dove straight down, using gravity to build speed that no pursuing aircraft could match. Dalton's voice crackled over the radio, confused and angry. "What the hell is she doing?" In the tower, General Garrison lowered his binoculars and leaned forward. This wasn't standard dogfighting technique. This was something else entirely. Rachel's aircraft screamed toward the desert floor, building speed until her airframe groaned under the stress. At the last possible second, she pulled out of the dive and rolled hard to the left, coming up behind Dalton's F-16 with a speed advantage that made his electronic warfare suite irrelevant. "Viper lead! You have tone!" she called over the radio, using the traditional phrase that meant missile lock achieved. In a real combat situation, Dalton would be dead. The radio exploded with chatter from the control tower. "Echo 5, confirm engagement." "Did you just—" "Confirm tone on Viper lead," Rachel replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Exercise complete." Below, General Garrison was already walking toward his sedan, but not before turning to Major Brooks with an expression that could have melted steel. The Major's face had gone pale as he realized what had just happened. Rachel had won. Not just the exercise, but she'd done it with a handicap that should have made victory impossible. And she'd done it in a way that no one, not Brooks, not Dalton, not even the general himself, had ever seen before. As she brought her F-16 in for landing, Rachel allowed herself a small smile. The whispers would continue, but now they'd be asking different questions. Not whether she belonged, but how she'd learned to fly like that. The real test was just beginning. The debriefing room felt like a courtroom, with Rachel sitting alone at one end of a long table, while Major Brooks and 3 other senior officers occupied the other end. The silence stretched for nearly 5 minutes before anyone spoke, and when Brooks finally opened his mouth, his voice carried the edge of a man who'd been caught off guard. "Care to explain that maneuver, Monroe?" Rachel kept her hands folded on the table, her expression neutral. "Which maneuver, sir?" "The one where you pulled a near-vertical climb followed by an inverted power dive that pushed your aircraft beyond safe operational limits." Brooks consulted his notes, though she could tell he was just buying time. "That's not in any training manual I've ever read." "No, sir, it's not." "Then where did you learn it?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Rachel knew that anything she said about her father's unofficial training would only make things worse. Colonel Monroe had bent more than a few rules teaching her to fly, and admitting that would put both of them in jeopardy. "Trial and error, sir. Simulator time." Brooks leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrow. Simulator time doesn't explain the precision of that maneuver, or the fact that you shut off your radio in the middle of an exercise. The radio was being jammed by Captain Dalton's electronic warfare suite. Shutting it off eliminated the distraction and allowed me to focus on flying. It was technically true, but Rachel knew it sounded like an excuse. Around the table, the other officers exchanged glances. She was walking a tightrope between honesty and insubordination, and everyone in the room knew it. Captain Lisa Park, the squadron's senior intelligence officer, spoke up. "Monroe, your personnel file shows extensive simulator time, but it doesn't show the kind of advanced combat training that would explain today's performance. Are you saying you developed these techniques on your own?" Rachel met her gaze steadily. "Yes, ma'am." It was a lie, and she hated herself for it, but protecting her father's reputation was more important than her own discomfort with deception. Brooks stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the flight line. "Here's what I think happened, Monroe. I think your father has been giving you private lessons that aren't on the books. I think you've been flying combat maneuvers in restricted airspace without authorization, and I think today's little demonstration was just showing off." The accusation hit like a slap. Rachel felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice level. "Sir, my father is a decorated officer who follows regulations to the letter. Any suggestion otherwise is what? Unthinkable?" Brooks turned back to face her. "Your father has a reputation for bending rules when it suits his purposes. Everyone on this base knows it." "That's enough." The voice came from the doorway, and everyone in the room turned to see Colonel James Monroe himself stepping inside. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. "Major Brooks, if you have concerns about my conduct, you can address them with me directly." Brooks straightened, suddenly aware that he'd crossed a line. "Colonel, I was simply trying to understand. You were making unfounded accusations against a fellow officer in front of junior personnel." Monroe's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it. "That's not professional conduct, Major." The room fell silent. Rachel watched her father with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. His intervention might help her in the short term, but it would also confirm Brooks' suspicions about their relationship. "Sir," Brooks said carefully, "I apologize if my comments were inappropriate, but the fact remains that Lieutenant Monroe's performance today was unusual." "Unusual how? She completed the exercise successfully, didn't she?" "She defeated an opponent with superior equipment and 15 years more experience," Captain Park interjected. "That's not unusual, Colonel. That's nearly impossible." Monroe's expression didn't change. "Are you suggesting that excellence is suspicious, Captain?" "I'm suggesting that this level of skill doesn't develop overnight, sir. And if Lieutenant Monroe has been receiving training that isn't documented in her record, that's a problem we need to address." Rachel felt the walls closing in around her. She could see the trap being set: either admit to the unauthorized training and face charges, or continue lying and risk even worse consequences when the truth eventually came out. But before she could speak, her father made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "You're right, Captain Park. Rachel has been receiving additional training from me, on weekends and during leave time, using privately owned aircraft, at civilian airfields." He paused, letting the admission sink in. "All of it legal, all of it documented with the appropriate civilian authorities, and none of it requiring military approval, since it involved no military assets or restricted airspace." Brooks leaned forward. "Colonel, are you saying—" "I'm saying that my daughter asked me to help her become a better pilot, and I agreed. We used civilian aircraft, civilian airspace, and civilian facilities. At no point did we violate military regulations or use military resources for unauthorized purposes." It was a masterful defense, Rachel realized. Her father had found a way to admit to the training while making it technically legal, but she also knew that the distinction between civilian and military training was thinner than he was making it sound. "Sir," she said quietly, "I appreciate your support, but—" "Lieutenant," Monroe's voice cut her off gently but firmly, "you're not in trouble. You've done nothing wrong except excel at your job. That seems to make some people uncomfortable, but that's their problem, not yours. Major Brooks looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. Colonel, with respect, this raises questions about fairness and equal opportunity. Other pilots don't have access to personal instruction from decorated combat veterans. Then perhaps other pilots should ask their parents for help, Monroe replied smoothly. Last I checked, seeking additional education wasn't against regulations. The meeting ended inconclusively, but Rachel knew the real damage had been done. As she walked out of the building with her father, she could feel eyes following them, some curious, some resentful, all calculating. "Dad," she said quietly when they were out of earshot, "you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." He stopped, walking, and turned to face her. "Rachel, I've been in this business for 30 years. I know how it works. They were going to keep digging until they found something to use against you. Better to control the narrative than let them write it." She nodded, but something cold had settled in her stomach. The protection her father offered came with a price, now. She'd always be seen as the pilot who needed Daddy's help to succeed. "What happens now?" Monroe's expression was grim. "Now they're going to test you harder than they've ever tested anyone. They'll be looking for any sign of weakness, any excuse. To prove that your success today was a fluke." He put a hand on her shoulder. "But I have faith in you. You've got something special, Rachel. Don't let them take that away from you." As her father walked away, Rachel stood alone on the tarmac, watching the sun set over the Nevada desert. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities for her critics to prove she didn't belong. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at Nellis, she felt like she had a chance. She just had to be perfect. Every single day. Forever. 3 weeks after the dogfighting incident, Rachel's life had become a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare. Major Brooks hadn't forgotten his public embarrassment, and he'd made sure that every training exercise, every duty assignment, and every evaluation pushed her to the absolute limit. She was scheduled for pre-dawn simulator sessions while other BAM pilots slept in. Her aircraft maintenance checks were triple verified, causing delays that made her late for briefings. Her flight assignments paired her with the most difficult partners in the worst weather conditions during the most challenging exercises the squadron could devise. But the worst part wasn't the extra work, it was the isolation. Word had spread about her father's intervention, and now the other pilots treated her like a contaminated asset. They were professionally courteous but personally distant, as if getting too close might taint their own reputations. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was the exception. He still ate lunch with her, still offered advice when she looked overwhelmed, still treated her like a fellow pilot instead of a political liability. But even he was careful now, glancing around before speaking, keeping their conversations brief and focused on work. "You holding up okay?" he asked one Thursday afternoon as they sat in the nearly empty mess hall. Rachel pushed food around her plate without eating. She'd lost 10 pounds in 3 weeks, and sleep had become a luxury she couldn't afford. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Brooks has been grinding you into the ground, and everyone knows it. What he's doing isn't training. It's harassment." "I can handle it." "That's not the point. You shouldn't have to handle it." Marcus glanced around, then pulled out his phone. "I've been documenting some of this stuff. The extra duty assignments, the scheduling conflicts, the way he modifies." "Your exercises at the last minute, it's building a pattern." Rachel looked up sharply. "Marcus, don't. You'll just make yourself a target." "Maybe, but what's happening to you is wrong, and somebody needs to say it." Before Rachel could respond, Major Brooks himself walked into the mess hall, his eyes immediately finding their table. He approached with the deliberate stride of a man who enjoyed having power over others. "Monroe, Webb, mind if I join you?" Neither of them answered, but Brooks sat down anyway, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Monroe, I wanted to discuss your performance evaluation. It's coming up next week, and I thought you might appreciate some guidance." Rachel's stomach clenched. Performance evaluations determined promotions, assignments, and ultimately careers. A bad evaluation could end her flying days permanently. "What kind of guidance, sir?" "Well, let's be honest. Your flying skills are adequate, but there are concerns about your attitude, your ability to work as part of a team, your respect for chain of command." Brooks ticked off points on his fingers like he was reading from a checklist. "Some of your fellow pilots have expressed concerns about your reliability under pressure." It was a lie, and they all knew it. Rachel hadn't shown any signs of unreliability, and the pilots who might have complained weren't talking to her enough to form opinions about her attitude. "Sir, could you be more specific about these concerns? I'd like to address them." Brooks's smile widened. "Of course. For example, there's the incident where you shut off your radio during a training exercise without authorization. That shows poor judgment and potential safety risks. I explained that my radio was being jammed by equipment that your opponent was authorized to use. Shutting off your radio because you didn't like the conditions shows an inability to adapt to realistic combat scenarios." Marcus started to say something, but Rachel caught his eye and shook her head slightly. This was her fight. "Sir, with respect, I adapted to the conditions and completed the mission successfully." "By using dangerous maneuvers that put yourself and others at risk. That's not adaptation, Monroe. That's recklessness masquerading as skill." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Brooks systematically dismantling every achievement Rachel had earned since arriving at Nellis. By the time he left, she felt like she'd been flayed alive in front of an audience. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered when Brooks was out of earshot. "He's really going to try to wash you out, isn't he?" Rachel stared at her untouched food, her hands trembling slightly. "Yeah, I think he is." That night, alone in her quarters, Rachel finally let herself feel the full weight of what she was facing. Brooks had the power to destroy her career. With a few carefully chosen words on an evaluation form, he had the support of pilots who saw her as a threat to their own advancement. And he had the perfect cover story: discipline problems, safety concerns, inability to work with others. She pulled out her phone and stared at her father's contact information. One call would bring help. Colonel Monroe could make a few phone calls of his own, pull some strings, maybe get her transferred to a different unit where she could start fresh. But that would prove everything Brooks had said about her, that she was just another nepotism case, another daddy's girl who couldn't make it on her own merit. Rachel put the phone away. The next morning brought new orders. She was assigned to a solo training mission, a routine navigation exercise through mountainous terrain in eastern Nevada. It should have been straightforward, but something about the timing felt wrong. Solo missions were usually reserved for experienced pilots, and they were never scheduled during weather advisories. She checked the meteorological reports 3 times, confirming what she'd already suspected. A storm system was moving through the area, bringing high winds and low visibility conditions that would make navigation challenging even for veteran pilots. Major Brooks was sending her up in dangerous conditions alone, with orders to complete a mission that would test her skills to the absolute limit. If she failed, if she got lost, made a navigation error, or crashed, it would be the perfect end to his campaign against her. But if she refused the mission, citing safety concerns, it would prove his point about her reliability and courage. Rachel stood at the window of her quarters, watching storm clouds gather over the mountains. In 6 hours, she'd be flying through. That weather, alone with everyone on the base waiting to see if she'd come back in one piece. For the first time since arriving at Nellis, she felt truly afraid. But fear, she realized, wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It meant she understood the stakes, and understanding the stakes meant she could prepare for them. She spent the rest of the morning studying weather patterns, memorizing emergency procedures, and planning contingency routes. If Brooks wanted to see how she handled adversity, she'd show him exactly what Colonel Monroe's daughter was made of. The storm was coming, but she'd be ready for it. The storm clouds had thickened by the time Rachel completed her pre-flight inspection, casting the Nevada desert in an ominous twilight despite the early afternoon hour. Wind gusts rocked her F-16 as she went through her checklist, and she could see lightning flickering in the mountains where she'd be flying in less than an hour. Major Brooks appeared beside her aircraft, clipboard in hand, and that familiar cold smile on his face. "Weather's looking a bit rough, Monroe. You sure you're up for this?" It was a trap question, and they both knew it. Say yes, and she'd be flying into dangerous conditions that could kill her. Say no, and he'd have proof that she lacked the courage for combat flying. Rachel looked up from her checklist, meeting his gaze steadily. "Weather's within acceptable parameters for the mission profile, sir. I'm ready to proceed." "Good, because I've made a few adjustments to your route." Brooks handed her a revised flight plan, and Rachel's heart sank as she scanned the coordinates. Instead of the standard training route through relatively open terrain, he'd routed her through the most challenging mountain passes in the region, areas where the weather would be at its worst and radio communication would be spotty at best. "Sir, this route takes me through restricted airspace near the weapons testing range. Temporary restrictions have been lifted for your training mission. You have full clearance." Brooks checked his watch. "You're scheduled for takeoff in 15 minutes. Any problems with that?" Rachel wanted to tell him exactly what she thought of his adjustments, but she bit back the words. Instead, she folded the flight plan and tucked it into her cockpit folder. "No problems, sir." As Brooks walked away, Rachel felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Lieutenant Webb, his expression grim. "I heard about the route change," he said quietly. "This is insane, Rachel. That's not training. It's attempted murder." "I know." She kept her voice low, aware of the ground crew working nearby. "But I don't have a choice. If I refuse, Brooks gets exactly what he wants. And if you don't refuse, you might not come back." Marcus glanced around, then pulled out his phone. "I've been in contact with someone, a reporter who specializes in military affairs. If something happens to you up there—" "No." Rachel's voice was sharp. "I'm not dying today, Marcus. And I'm not giving Brooks the satisfaction of seeing me." "Quit!" "Then what are you going to do?" Rachel looked up at the storm clouds, then back at her aircraft. An idea was forming, dangerous and probably stupid, but it was the only chance she had to turn the tables on Major Brooks. "I'm going to give him exactly what he asked for." 20 minutes later, Rachel was airborne, her F-16 climbing through increasingly turbulent air toward the mountain passes. The radio crackled with weather updates, all of them bad. Visibility was dropping, winds were gusting over 40 knots, and the storm front was moving faster than predicted. "Echo 5, this is Nellis Tower. We're showing deteriorating conditions. Along your route, do you want to return to base?" Rachel smiled grimly. The tower operator was giving her an out, but she knew Brooks would be listening to every word. "Negative, Nellis Tower. Weather is manageable. Continuing with mission as planned." She clicked off the radio and settled in for the fight of her life. The first 20 minutes were merely difficult. The F-16 bucked and rolled through turbulence that would have grounded civilian aircraft, but Rachel held her course, following the revised route through mountain passes where the wind howled like a living thing. Then the visibility dropped to near zero. She was flying through clouds so thick she couldn't see her own wingtips, relying entirely on instruments while winds tried to slam her aircraft into mountainsides she couldn't see. Every few seconds, lightning lit up the cockpit, and thunder crashed around her with physical force. But Rachel had trained for this, not in the simulator and not in any official capacity, but in those secret flights with her father through the New Mexico desert. He'd taught her to fly by feel, to trust her instincts when instruments failed, to find her way through impossible conditions using skills that couldn't be taught in a classroom. "Echo 5, Nellis Tower, we've lost you on radar. Please respond with your position." Rachel checked her instruments. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, following the route Brooks had given her with precision that would have impressed her harshest critics. But instead of reporting her position, she made a decision that would change everything. "Nellis Tower, Echo 5, I'm declaring an emergency." The radio exploded with chatter. "Echo 5, state the nature of your emergency." "I've discovered unauthorized personnel in restricted airspace. Multiple contacts, low altitude, no transponder signals. Possible hostile aircraft." It was a lie, of course. There were no unauthorized aircraft in the area. But Rachel knew that declaring a security emergency would trigger protocols that even Major Brooks couldn't override. Air traffic control would have to scramble additional aircraft to investigate, senior officers would be notified, and most importantly, every word of radio communication would be recorded and preserved. Echo 5, can you confirm hostile aircraft? Negative confirmation, but contacts are behaving suspiciously, requesting immediate backup and full investigation. Rachel wasn't just calling for help. She was creating a documented record of her professionalism under extreme conditions. When the investigation was complete and no hostile aircraft were found, the incident would show that she'd handled a perceived threat exactly by the book, even while flying through the worst weather in months. But more importantly, it would trigger a review of why she'd been sent on this mission in the first place. Within minutes, 2 more F-16s were scrambling from Nellis to provide backup. The base commander was being briefed on the potential security breach, and Major Brooks was being asked to explain why he'd sent a single pilot into restricted airspace during a storm without proper oversight. Rachel guided her F-16 through the mountain passes with methodical precision, maintaining radio contact with the backup aircraft and following every procedure in the book. By the time she landed back at Nellis 2 hours later, the base was buzzing with activity. General Garrison himself was waiting on the tarmac. As Rachel climbed down from her cockpit, the general approached with an expression she couldn't read. Behind him, she could see Major Brooks standing with several other senior officers, his face pale and tight. "Lieutenant Monroe," Garrison said, quietly. "Hell of a flight." "Yes, sir. Conditions were challenging." "I'm sure they were." Garrison glanced at the other officers, then back at her. "Your emergency report triggered a full security review. We've had aircraft searching the area for 2 hours, and satellite imagery is being analyzed as we speak." Rachel kept her expression neutral. "I hope they find what they're looking for, sir." "Oh, I think we already have." Garrison's smile was slight but significant. "Your radio communications during the incident have been exemplary, Lieutenant. Calm, professional, exactly what we'd expect from one of our best pilots." The emphasis on best pilots was unmistakable, and Rachel saw Brooks flinch slightly. "Thank you, sir." "Major Brooks," Garrison called out, "I'd like to speak with you about the mission planning for today's exercise. There seem to be some questions about proper oversight procedures." As the group of officers walked away, Rachel stood alone on the tarmac, finally allowing herself to breathe normally. She'd survived Brooks' attempt to destroy her, and in the process, she'd created a paper trail that would make it very difficult for him to try again, but the real victory wasn't in the bureaucratic maneuvering. It was in the knowledge that she'd flown through conditions that would have broken most pilots, and she'd done it with the kind of precision and professionalism that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. She was no longer just Colonel Monroe's daughter, she was Echo 5, and she'd earned that call sign the hard way. The investigation that followed Rachel's emergency report was swift and thorough. Within 48 hours, 3 different review boards had examined every aspect of the mission: the flight plan, the weather conditions, the authorization procedures, and most importantly, the decision-making process that had put a single pilot into dangerous airspace during a severe storm. Rachel found herself sitting across from Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base's deputy commander for operations, in a conference room that felt more like a sanctuary than an interrogation chamber. Hayes was known for her fairness and her intolerance, for politics that interfered with mission effectiveness. "Lieutenant Monroe, I've reviewed your flight performance from yesterday's mission. Your navigation was flawless, your emergency protocols were textbook perfect, and your radio communications showed remarkable composure under pressure." Hayes consulted her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be extensive notes. "I'm curious about your decision to declare an emergency based on unconfirmed radar contacts." Rachel had spent the last 2 days preparing for this question. "Ma'am, given the restricted nature of the airspace and the unusual flight patterns I observed, I felt it was better to err on the side of caution. In a post-9/11 environment, unidentified aircraft in sensitive areas require immediate investigation. Even though you suspected the contacts might be false readings caused by weather interference?" It was a trap question, but Rachel had anticipated it. Ma'am, my job was to report what I observed and follow proper protocols. Determining the nature of the contacts was beyond my authority and expertise. Hayes smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Rachel had seen from a senior officer in weeks. That's exactly the right answer, Lieutenant. You showed good judgment and proper respect for chain of command. The colonel closed her tablet and leaned back in her chair. Now let's talk about the circumstances that led to yesterday's mission. I've been reviewing Major Brooks's training assignments over the past month, and I'm seeing some interesting patterns. Rachel's pulse quickened. This was the moment she'd been hoping for. Official recognition that Brooks's behavior had crossed the line from demanding training into personal vendetta. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. I think you understand perfectly. Hayes pulled out a thick folder and opened it. Excessive simulator time, modified flight plans issued at the last minute, pairing junior pilots with incompatible equipment, loads and routing training missions through hazardous weather without proper oversight. These aren't teaching tools, Lieutenant. They're administrative weapons. The relief Rachel felt was almost overwhelming. Someone in authority had finally seen through Brooks's facade and recognized what he'd been doing. What happens now, Ma'am? Now, Major Brooks gets to explain his training methodology to a review board that includes General Garrison himself. Hayes stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. As for you, Lieutenant, you're being reassigned to direct reporting under my office. No more modified flight plans, no more last-minute equipment changes, and no more solo missions in restricted airspace unless there's a legitimate operational need. As Rachel left the conference room, she felt lighter than she had in months, but her relief was short-lived. As she walked across the base toward her quarters, she spotted Major Brooks near the Flight Operations Building, and his expression told her that he knew exactly what had happened in her meeting with Colonel Hayes. He intercepted her path with the purposeful stride of a man who had nothing left to lose. Congratulations, Monroe. You managed to turn your incompetence into a promotion. Rachel stopped walking but didn't respond. She'd learned that anything she said to Brooks would be twisted and used against her later. You think you've won something here? He continued, his voice low and bitter. But all you've done is prove that you can't handle real pressure. You needed Daddy to bail you out before, and now you need the deputy commander to protect you from actual training. Major Brooks, Rachel said quietly, I completed every mission you assigned, under every condition you specified, with performance ratings that met or exceeded standards. If that's incompetence, then I'm not sure what competence looks like. Brooks stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. Competence looks like earning your place instead of having it handed to you. Competence looks like respecting the chain of command instead of running to higher authority when things get difficult. You mean the way you respected chain of command, when you modified my missions without proper authorization? The question hit like a physical blow. Brooks's face went pale, and for a moment he seemed to struggle for words. Those modifications were within my authority as squadron training officer. Were they? Because Colonel Hayes seems to think otherwise? Rachel kept her voice level, professional. She mentioned something about a review board. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your training methodology. For the first time since she'd arrived at Nellis, Rachel saw something in Brooks's eyes that wasn't anger or condescension. It was fear. He was finally beginning to understand that his campaign against her had backfired spectacularly. Instead of proving she didn't belong, he'd created a documented record of harassment that would end his career if it went much further. This isn't over, Monroe. Yes, sir, it is. Rachel walked away, leaving Brooks standing alone on the tarmac. But she knew he was right about one thing. This wasn't over. It was about to get much worse for him, and much better for her. That evening, Lieutenant Webb found her in the mess hall, and for the first time in weeks, he was smiling. Have you heard? He asked, sliding into the seat across from her. Heard what? Brooks is being transferred, effective immediately. Something about inappropriate training methodologies and failure to follow proper oversight procedures. Marcus grinned. Word is General Garrison himself recommended the transfer after reviewing the investigation findings. Rachel felt a surge of satisfaction, followed immediately by caution. Where's he being transferred to? Desk job at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. No more flight training responsibility, no more squadron command authority. Basically, they've grounded him permanently. It was better than Rachel had dared hope for. Brooks wasn't just being moved. He was being neutralized, stripped of the power he'd used to make her life miserable. "There's more," Marcus continued. "Colonel Hayes is taking over direct supervision of flight training for the entire wing. And guess who she's asked to help design new evaluation protocols for pilot development?" Rachel's eyes widened. "No. Yes. She wants you to help create a system that identifies and develops exceptional talent while preventing the kind of harassment that Brooks was dishing out." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Rachel, you're not just surviving this anymore. You're about to help rewrite the rules." For the first time since arriving at Nellis Air Force Base, Rachel Monroe allowed herself to imagine a future where her abilities mattered more than her last name, where excellence was rewarded instead of punished, and where the next young pilot who showed unusual promise wouldn't have to endure what she'd been through. The whispers would continue, but now they'd be asking different questions. Not whether she belonged, but how she'd managed to turn a career-ending campaign of harassment into an opportunity to change the entire system. She was still Echo 5, but now that call sign meant something entirely different. 3 days after Major Brooks's transfer orders were announced, Rachel was called to an emergency briefing that would test everything she'd learned about military politics, personal courage, and the price of standing up for what was right. The briefing room was packed with more senior officers than she'd ever seen in one place. General Garrison sat at the head of the table, flanked by Colonel Hayes and 2 officers Rachel didn't recognize, one wearing the insignia of Internal Affairs, the other bearing the eagle of a full colonel from Pentagon Oversight. "Lieutenant Monroe," General Garrison began, his voice carrying the weight of formal proceedings, "you've been called here to provide testimony regarding training, procedures, and command decisions that occurred during your assignment to this squadron." Rachel took her seat at the far end of the table, acutely aware that every word she spoke would be recorded and analyzed. This wasn't just a debriefing. It was a formal investigation that could determine the careers of multiple officers. The Internal Affairs Officer, Colonel David Reeves, opened a thick folder and consulted his notes. "Lieutenant, I want to be clear about the scope of this investigation. We're not just examining Major Brooks's conduct toward you specifically. We're investigating a pattern of behavior that may have affected multiple personnel over several years." The implication hit Rachel like a thunderbolt. She wasn't Brooks's only victim. There had been others, and her case had finally given them the courage to come forward. "Sir, I understand." "Good. Now I need you to walk me through the sequence of events that led to your emergency declaration during the mountain training mission." Reeves's pen was poised over his notepad. "But first I want you to know that Major Brooks has filed a counter-complaint alleging that you deliberately filed a false emergency report to avoid completing a legitimate training exercise." Rachel's blood ran cold. Even in defeat, Brooks was trying to destroy her by claiming she'd lied about the radar contacts. "Sir, I reported exactly what I observed during the mission. My emergency declaration was based on radar signatures that appeared consistent with unauthorized aircraft in restricted airspace. But you knew the signatures were likely weather-related interference, didn't you?" It was the question Rachel had been dreading. If she admitted to suspecting the contacts were false, it would support Brooks' allegation that she'd filed a deliberately misleading report. But if she claimed complete certainty about hostile aircraft, she'd be lying under oath. She chose a third option, the truth. "Sir, I suspected the contacts might be weather interference, but I couldn't be certain. Given the sensitive nature of the airspace and the potential security implications, I felt it was appropriate to err on the side of caution and follow established protocols for reporting unidentified aircraft." Colonel Reeves made notes, his expression unreadable. "And you maintain that your decision had nothing to do with the difficult conditions you were flying in, or any desire to cut short a challenging mission?" "No, sir. I completed the full mission profile as assigned, maintained all required checkpoints, and returned to base only after backup aircraft confirmed no hostile presence in the area." The Pentagon officer, Colonel Angela Torres, leaned forward. Lieutenant Monroe, I've reviewed the flight data from your aircraft's onboard systems. Your navigation was precise to within meters of the assigned route, even in zero visibility conditions. Your radio communications were professional throughout. The incident and your fuel consumption indicates you flew the complete mission profile without any shortcuts or deviations. She paused, consulting her own notes. In fact, the data suggests you flew a more challenging route than was actually required by the mission parameters. Care to explain that? Rachel realized she was walking into another trap. If she admitted that Brooks had modified her route to make it more dangerous, she'd be validating the harassment allegations. But if she claimed the route was her choice, she'd look reckless. Ma'am, I flew the route as specified in the revised flight plan provided by Major Brooks immediately before takeoff. Revised flight plan? Colonel Torres raised an eyebrow. The original mission plan called for standard navigation through the Eastern Training Corridor. Are you saying Major Brooks changed your route without prior authorization? This was the moment Rachel had been preparing for. Her answer would either vindicate her completely or destroy any credibility she'd built up. Yes, ma'am. Major Brooks provided a modified route approximately 15 minutes before takeoff, directing me through mountain passes that were significantly more challenging than the original plan. General Garrison spoke for the first time since the questioning began. Lieutenant, did you question this modification at the time? I noted that the revised route passed through restricted airspace, sir. Major Brooks assured me that clearances had been obtained. And had they been? Rachel met the general's gaze steadily. I don't know, sir. I assumed that my commanding officer had obtained proper authorization before modifying a training mission. The room fell silent. What Rachel had just described, a last-minute route change through restricted airspace without proper documentation, was a serious violation of flight safety protocols, regardless of any personal animosity between her and Brooks. Colonel Reeves closed his folder. Lieutenant Monroe, I have one final question. If you had to do it again, would you handle the situation differently? Rachel considered her answer carefully. This was her chance to show regret, to second-guess herself, to appear more humble and cooperative. But it was also her chance to defend every decision she'd made. No, sir, I followed proper protocols for reporting potential security threats. I completed my assigned mission despite hazardous conditions, and I maintained professional standards throughout. I believe those were the correct decisions. After she was dismissed, Rachel waited in the hallway outside the briefing room, her heart pounding as she listened to the muffled voices continuing the discussion inside. 20 minutes later, Colonel Hayes emerged and gestured for her to follow. Walk with me, Lieutenant. They strolled across the base in companionable silence until they reached a quiet spot overlooking the flight line. Hayes finally spoke, her voice thoughtful. You know, I've been in the Air Force for 22 years, and I've seen a lot of talented people destroyed by politics they didn't understand. When you first arrived here, I thought you might be one of them. Rachel waited, unsure whether this was leading toward praise or criticism. But what happened in there, Hayes continued, that was impressive. You told the truth, even when it was difficult. You stood behind your decisions, even when you were being pressured to second-guess yourself. And you did it all without throwing anyone under the bus or playing the victim. Ma'am, I just tried to answer the questions honestly, Hayes smiled. That's exactly what I mean. You don't even realize how rare that is. She turned to face Rachel directly. The investigation board is going to find that Major Brooks violated multiple protocols and created a hostile work environment. His transfer is permanent, and there will be formal reprimands in his file. Relief flooded through Rachel, but Hayes wasn't finished. More importantly, your performance during this entire ordeal has attracted attention at levels you probably don't realize. There are people in Washington who are very interested in pilots who can handle extreme pressure while maintaining professional standards. What does that mean? It means your next assignment probably won't be at Nellis. It means you'll be flying missions that matter, with people who understand what real excellence looks like. Hayes checked her watch. But that's a conversation for another day. Right now, you have a squadron that needs to see their newest ace pilot in action. As Colonel Hayes walked away, Rachel stood alone overlooking the flight line, watching F-16s take off into the clear Nevada sky. For the first time since arriving at the base, she felt like she truly belonged. Not because of her father's reputation or despite the obstacles she'd faced, but because she'd proven herself in the most demanding way possible. The whispers would continue, but now they carried a different message. Echo 5 wasn't just another pilot. She was the one who'd faced down the system and won. 6 months later, Rachel Monroe stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, wearing the silver wings of a test pilot and carrying orders that would take her to Edwards Air Force Base, the epicenter of experimental flight testing and the launching pad for careers that changed aviation history. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by her father, General Garrison, Colonel Hayes, and Lieutenant Webb, who had earned his own promotion to flight instructor after documenting the systematic harassment that had plagued the Nellis. Training program. Captain Monroe, General Garrison said, using her new rank for the first time in an official capacity. Your new assignment comes with challenges that will make your experience at Nellis look like basic training. You'll be testing aircraft systems that don't have names yet, pushing boundaries that haven't been mapped, and working with technology that's classified so far above your current clearance level that you'll need 6 months of security briefings, just to understand what you're not allowed to talk about. Rachel smiled, remembering the young woman who had walked into Nellis Air Force Base 8 months earlier, convinced she had something to prove to the world. That woman had been replaced by someone who knew her own worth and didn't need external validation to define it. Sir, I'm ready for whatever comes next. I believe you are? Garrison handed her a sealed envelope. Your first assignment at Edwards is to evaluate a new flight control system that integrates human intuition with artificial intelligence. The project is called Vector Protocol, and it's based on maneuvers that a certain pilot developed during some rather creative emergency procedures. Rachel's eyes widened as she realized what he was telling her. The improvised techniques she'd used to save Captain Dalton and navigate through the mountain storm had been analyzed, refined, and turned into official training protocols. Her instinctive flying style was becoming the foundation for next-generation pilot development. Sir, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just keep doing what you've been doing. Garrison's expression became serious. But remember, Captain, at Edwards, everyone is exceptional. Everyone has a story like yours. The difference between success and failure won't be talent or courage. It'll be your ability to work with people who are just as good as you are. After the ceremony, Rachel found herself alone with her father in a quiet corridor overlooking the Potomac River. Colonel Monroe had aged noticeably during the Nellis investigation, the stress of watching his daughter fight for her career taking a visible toll. Dad, I need to say something. He looked at her expectantly. When this all started, I resented the fact that people saw me as your daughter instead of my own person. I thought it was holding me back, making people question whether I deserved my opportunities. And now, Rachel smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced since childhood. Now I realize that being your daughter isn't something I need to overcome. It's something I get to live up to. You taught me to fly, but more importantly, you taught me to have integrity under pressure. That's what got me through the last 8 months. Colonel Monroe's eyes glistened slightly. Rachel, you've accomplished something I never could. You've proven that excellence doesn't require politics, that integrity doesn't require compromise, and that standing up for what's right doesn't require destroying others. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. I'm proud of the pilot you've become, but I'm even prouder of the person you are. Later that evening, Rachel sat alone in her quarters at Bolling Air Force Base, packing for her move to California. On her desk lay the investigation report that had cleared her name and ended Major Brooks' military career. She'd read it once, then filed it away. The past was over. The future was what mattered now. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Webb. Saw the news about your promotion. Edwards is lucky to have you. Don't forget about us little people when you're testing space planes. She smiled and typed back, Thanks for believing in me when no one else would. Maybe someday I'll get to test your flight plans. Looking forward to it, Captain. Rachel set down her phone and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of Washington, D.C. Somewhere in those buildings, decisions were being made that would shape the future of American aviation. And tomorrow, She'd begin the journey that would put her at the center of those decisions. The call sign Echo 5 would stay with her, but its meaning had evolved. No longer the mark of a pilot who flew without sound, it had become something deeper, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories happen in silence, without fanfare or recognition, when a person chooses to do what's right, despite the cost. She thought about the young pilots who would come after her, who would face their own major brooks, their own moments of doubt and pressure and impossible choices. Maybe they'd hear her story and find the courage to stand up for themselves. Maybe they'd learn that excellence and integrity weren't mutually exclusive, that being exceptional didn't require being perfect, and that the most important battles were often fought alone. Rachel Monroe had arrived at Nellis Air Force Base. As the daughter of a famous pilot, she was leaving as Captain Monroe, test pilot, protocol developer, and proof that sometimes the system works exactly the way it should, when someone is willing to make it work, regardless of the personal cost. The sky was calling again, bigger and more challenging than ever, and Echo 5 was ready to answer. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.